Dr. Allison, I have a friend, Caleb Jackson, and he's actually a Christian. He's defended the resurrection on my channel with a skeptic on my channel. Really, really wonderful guy, because one of the things I like about him most is he's just level-headed. You could tell he can take criticism and ideas and it doesn't offend him like a fundamentalist. So he says, hey, can you ask Dr. Allison the following? You've argued that Jesus predicted the imminent end of the world, the Parousia, and his own resurrection. Why did the earliest Christians separate the resurrection from the second coming instead of seeing them as simultaneous, as previously thought? Why did they say that Jesus had already been raised, but still considered the second coming to be a near future event that remained unfulfilled? Why not see both as fulfilled at the same time?
Okay, both fulfilled at the same time in the resurrection in AD 30 or 33, I assume he's meaning. Okay, let's see if I can unpack this. Hope I don't get this wrong. So there are a few scholars who have thought that, in fact, the Parousia was Easter. If you look at Joachim Jeremias' New Testament theology, the sayings of Jesus, he argues that Easter was the Parousia. Easter was the Parousia. It was the coming of the Son of Man in glory. And a few other German scholars have argued the same thing. So let me start with this. My own view is that Jesus' imminent eschatology was a collective vision. In other words, he thought that he was living in the time of tribulation, the time of great distress before the end, during which people would be persecuted, saints would die, and so on. And then, being who he was, he believed that beyond that tribulation, beyond that death, beyond that martyrdom, there would be vindication and the end would come. The glorious end would come. The Son of Man would come, the dead would rise, and so on. And this was all within the framework of an imminent expectation. So what happens, in my judgment, is kind of obvious. Jesus dies. The tomb is likely empty. Certainly there are stories about the tomb being empty, I think, from an early time. And then there are people who report seeing Jesus. So they're going to construe what has happened to them and to Jesus in the light of the forecasts or the predictions. This is what you see with Messianic movement after Messianic movement. They try to fit what happens into the prophecies, even if they don't fit together. And so what happens is the early Christians said, well, Jesus died, he's a martyr, and he's risen from the dead, but it was obvious that nobody else had risen from the dead. And so what this meant was that his end, his death and resurrection, had to be the beginning of the end or the start of the end. That's where you get the language of first fruits. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul thinks that Jesus' resurrection must be the start of the whole show. And again, that weird passage in Matthew 27 where Jesus dies and the saints come out of their tombs going to Jerusalem. This somehow, I don't know exactly where this comes from, but I think it probably functioned originally as, it's not just Jesus who is rising from the dead. It's sort of a story version of the first fruits. I mean, he's not the only guy. So things are really starting to happen. The end is really coming. But what happens then is you go on and days pass and weeks pass and years pass. And it's obvious that the end hasn't come. Because remember, in Judaism, the end functions to solve the problem of evil. That's what's really driving behind it. And the end fixes things. The end repairs the world. But as time goes on, it's obvious that the world has not been repaired, and Caesar is still on the throne. And so Jesus' victory has to be a sort of, invisible victory in the heavenly sphere. He says that's where he sits on his throne, not in Jerusalem, and so on. So it's very natural as time goes on that these things split. And I think the way to think about it is this, that when the early Christians first proclaimed Jesus' resurrection, they are again doing it within an imminent framework. That is, they believe the end is really near. But as time goes on, as time goes on, anything that is going to happen is down the road. And so what originally was thought of as one kind of event, or an event that has started, event has been inaugurated, once you put decades between that or years between that doesn't make sense anymore. So then you get a split. And so what you get is, well, all the stuff that hasn't happened now, or all the stuff that hasn't been fulfilled, the resolution of the world, the defeat of Satan, that goes at the end. But I should say that it's not a neat thing. So if you look at the Gospel of John, I think you see a remnant of this idea that, the end has come. Satan is defeated at the cross. But you read commentators later on and they'll say, Satan is alive and well. Satan is pretty active. What sense does it make to say that Satan was defeated at the cross? And you can find very puzzling statements. What the heck does this mean? So Jesus's fate gets interpreted in terms of eschatology and the end, but then the end doesn't come, right? Everything is not fulfilled. And so you have to have first advent and second advent. And I actually think that's what happens with the passion predictions, because the passion predictions, in the form we have them now, are just about Jesus. Jesus is going to Jerusalem, Jesus is going to die, and Jesus is going to rise from the dead. I think if those sayings go back to Jesus, they must have been collective. We are in the middle of the tribulation. Some of us are going to die. Some standing here, may not taste death, which means some of us will. But the resurrection, the vindication, the coming of the Son of Man is on the other side. But since it doesn't happen in a collective way, you end up revising the tradition so that it's about Jesus alone. But I can't imagine, given what I know about first century Judaism, that he ever thought in those terms himself. There is no such thing as an individual undergoing the end and nobody else undergoing the end. That's something that's forced upon them by circumstances.
So technically what we have is we have kind of our earliest witnesses or Christian witnesses in text, like the Gospels, Paul, others they are clearly carrying an apocalyptic expectation, and they're the ones doing the interpreting here of trying to make sense of the data. So whatever the original earliest Jesus, if I could use the term movement, or what he was preaching, is now being interpreted based on the circumstances of whoever these authors are, and they're trying to make sense of it. Like John has Satan defeated at the cross, probably because he's starting to spiritualize and internalize the kingdom in a way, or somehow it's vertical, like you talked about, instead of being horizontal on history. And we see kind of a hint. If I could use the Gospel of Thomas as an example, it really blew my mind when I first got out of being a fundamentalist, was reading where they're like, when will be the repose of the dead? And he goes, look around, it's already happened, but you can't see it. It's already, so it's a spiritual resurrection, if you will.
So there's a whole subject there that's kind of in the shadows, and we can't really pull it out. But one of the pastoral letters refers to a couple of heretics who believe the resurrection is past already.
Yeah.
So what the heck was that? Are these people who sort of stuck with the original vision, and then they become preterists, in effect, right? The other thing to think about, and maybe I'll have time to do this before I drop dead, but I would like to look at other messianic movements and see and document the transition from futurist eschatology to vertical eschatology, because I'm pretty sure it's everywhere. I suspect that moving from the ghost dance to the peyote cult is something similar to what you find moving from the synoptics to the Gospel of John. That is, you have a future expectation. The ancestors are coming. The white men are going, right? The buffalo will come back. These are really heavily charged eschatological visions, and they did not come to pass. And what you then get after that is a sort of mysticism, and you can visit the other world and so on, and the focus is not so much on what's going to happen now in the future, but your relationship to the other world. You might see the same thing in some Jewish mysticism after the failures of 70 and the failures in 130s. Bar Kokhba a turn away from eschatology and a turn that way. And it may be that some of the so-called Gnostic texts are the same sort of thing. They grow out of Jewish and Christian awareness, consciously or unconsciously, that looking for the future, it hasn't worked. That's not where we're getting God. We're just getting more Caesar. So if we're going to find God, maybe it's going to be in a vertical fashion. So you reinterpret things. The kingdom of God now becomes within. And
is it fair to say, and I know I'm throwing in this huge wrench, but Gentiles into the movement. I mean, like, it's mind-boggling to me. Just looking at what you're saying there is very complex, and I love it. The more complex and more like controversial this is, I love it because it makes me realize how much they're sincere, but also they're humans like us. Like sometimes we put them on pedestals.
What else could that be?
I know, but like sometimes we put them on pedestals. Like we put them in this, like they're beyond anything we could even grasp. And I'm seeing myself to be able to relate to these people much more, trying to make sense of the world. I go through struggles. I think it's going to fix. It gets worse. Okay, how am I going to deal with it? Well, that's life for me. So it makes me see how human they are. But at the same time, Gentiles entering the movement, I wonder if if it ties into this eschatological. Paul Fredrickson, of course, writes in the end that there would be a regathering or the bring in. But Jesus, if I'm not mistaken, if we look at Matthew, doesn't seem to really have that on his radar. It's not even a concern of his, so to speak.
Oh, you're talking about Matthew? Oh, I think Matthew does at the end. So Matthew, and there are hints throughout the gospel. So the women in the genealogy are all Gentiles. And the Magi are almost certainly Gentiles, and at the end, it's go to all the nations, Pontatai Ethne. So, I mean, Matthew's is perfect because he's so Jewish in so many ways, and he marks the transition or the point at which you are seeing a movement cease to be Jewish and begin to be Gentile, and he's still open to it. My own reading of Matthew is that he's open to the Gentile movement, but I think he's also anxious. So Matthew, if you look at how he rewrites the little parable of the wineskins, he talks about preserving the old and the new. And then if you look at the end of chapter 13, the treasures, you bring out treasures old and new. That's what the scribe does, old and new. And I think his gospel is an attempt to hold together the old and the new, which in part means for him, Judaism. He doesn't want to lose the Jewish heritage, but he wants to be open to the new. And I think, the way I think of it is that Matthew intuits the coming of Marcion. That is, he intuits the full Gentile reinterpretation of this religion, and he doesn't want to go there. He wants to keep the old and the new together. And one of the neat things about Matthew's gospel is that it appears to have been the most popular among Jewish Christians and the most popular among Gentiles, and that's a real trick. So I think he's writing in a way that's trying to please and reconcile, keep both worlds, and it actually didn't happen. That is, Matthew's gospel is a failure because Jewish Christianity becomes very marginalized. By the 2nd century, it's already a minor thing. There are still outposts in the 4th century, right? Jerome seems to know a few things about some of these people, but it became a Gentile movement.
Thank you.